how an introduction of Lean looks like, and what are the experiences which we have made with managing such changes. And I think this quote of Jim Highsmith, which I have here, is already a good starting point, because it underlines that despite all the necessity to have some rules and some process which nobody really questions, independent whether it's Agile, Lean, or any other development paradigm, it's important to not overdo, to not have overly complex rules. So the logic here is that simple rules will have the stimulus to people to think. If processes, if rules, if environments are overly complex, and that holds as well for code as architecture, as process, it will lead to stupid behavior of just following and not anymore thinking whether it's applicable or not. And that's something to keep in mind here. If you look to industriality, and I just have here a few quotes of some journals, what we realize is that we see a lot of challenges in different sectors, like the upper left, which is from automotive. 80% of electronic control unit development overrun their budget. On the other side, we also see that there's a lot of push, like the IT Weekly in the middle, which is there's a price reduction, double-digit per year, which is independent whether we talk here about ICT or automotive. I know it from a lot of different industry domains. There's also levers, such as how to reduce cycle time, how to use variant management, how to control complexity. All that is happening on a day-to-day basis, and what we try to show here is what kind of success factors there are, and what can we learn from these different endeavors. I would start with plan-driven development as a baseline, because that's something which probably all of us had been exposed one way or the other. It's a development with focus on systematic analysis, planning and execution, typically with a clearly defined life cycle. And also here I want to underline that the concept of life cycle is not really abandoned if a company would work in Agile or Lean. I'm, for instance, working with a big healthcare supplier, and they are forced from FDA to have a very clear life cycle instrumented with a lot of quality gates. Nevertheless, they are able to work both with Lean concepts on the product development and product definition, and also with Lean, with Agile concepts in the entire development, like Scrum. In other words, life cycle per se is not plan-driven. Rather, plan-driven makes use of life cycle, makes use of milestones, but is primarily that tasks are planned to a high degree upfront. And often this is because of legislative obligations, governance principles which have been followed, and specifically where you have complex ventures with different suppliers, with different stakeholders of different companies, it's helpful to have such a skeleton. Plan-driven still is the most widely used paradigm. The drawback is what we all are aware of. It's too much formalism, it's too much administration, and often the rework cycles are quite extensive. So this is why other paradigms had been created, such as Agile, which had recently celebrated already a double-digit birthday. So this is something where we already have drawn a lot of experience over the past 15 years. And the major difference to plan-driven is that here is a strong focus on flexibility, on trust, on people, reduce overheads as much as possible. And this flexibility, this very lightweight control and process scheme, this is what will help in practice, but on the other side also creates certain risks, such as if there is big distributed organizations, For instance, I've been working with a couple of companies which are active in different continents, and while I very much emphasize Scrum in such setting, it needs huge discipline in order to get things done, and actually Scrum facilitates even distributed development. But I face much more companies which struggle on their way rather than who succeed, because evidently this everybody in one room approach with almost no documentation, a lot of things which are shared in the coffee corner, this will not work once it is distributed. Also, a couple of the principles like a customer on the project, like a continuous refactoring, this is not what is always feasible. So what I recommend in such cases to apply the principles, but very much also question and tailor these principles to the concrete setting. And this is actually what is also the quote of Jim Highsmith. Now, lean development, in a way, is the most recent in this list of 3 paradigms. It's not really young from an industry perspective. Lean manufacturing is, in fact, a quite old principle in order to reduce waste, to focus on what is at the moment the most important task. But it took a while until these principles had been distilled and then made applicable to development. And its key principle is end-to-end focus, to understand and deliver to customer needs, to minimize rework, to have very efficient work streams, empower teams, and continuous improvement. Now, one can argue this is in line with Agile, and in fact there's a couple of overlaps in these principles. A major difference is that Lean takes much more this end-to-end focus than many of the Agile paradigms, which look much more on specific things like Scrum and project management, or extreme programming related to implementation, feature-driven development related to increment planning. Lean is in a way a little bit more generalizing and trying to take the product focus. The effects is pretty much in line with what we heard. It's more customer value, it's more team spirit, it's reduced rework. The risks to struggle with uncertainties, with complexities, to overlook dependencies, this is something which we also see in Agile, and obviously complexity can kill any of these paradigms. So we can already draw here a very brief conclusion, which is risks are rather similar. Value from plan-driven is that you have this focus on a stable, a predictable, and understandable framework which supports many different stakeholders in even different companies over a long lifetime. Agile, which has this highly flexible approach, specifically with respect to project management and implementation. Lean development, which takes the product and end-to-end perspective, and in a way facilitates that Agile can be applied in a plan-driven context without the overhead and fat which you often see in a traditional, organically grown plan-driven approach. With this said, we can now focus on Lean, and I have summarized in this slide the key principles of Lean, which is starting with the value creation. That's very relevant. I think this step is the one which I always recommend the first. So in a way, this cycle here is also a kind of sorting according to the challenges, according to the difficulties in such Lean introduction. Value creation, the focus on value, that's something which is rather easy to achieve. It starts with requirements. It looks into priority setting. It looks into what's the value which we have from a certain set of requirements and from a perspective of the customer. It's not, in a way, trivial. This change of perspective from the inside to the outside is something where many people struggle, and it clearly also needs to have non-development stakeholders such as product management or marketing or sales to help getting the right perspective. The next topic is to eliminate waste, and that's the one which we most often hear as the one key principle, which I believe is a little bit exaggerated. Waste reduction, waste elimination, that's an important principle, but it's not the one and only principle which constitutes lean. It's about understanding where rework occurs, reducing this rework, and as much as possible try to anticipate what sources of defects, what sorts of rework there are. A third principle is to look into value streams. That's the one which is often underestimated and sometimes treated far too theoretically. I have seen lots of approach which are highly sophisticated using queuing theory, etc., which some of you might know from telecommunications. That's not really necessary. I mean, what's important is to draw simple with a whiteboard or a sheet of paper a flow of how do activities run. For instance, I have been called into a situation where the closure time of defects in a service-oriented company was too long. So what did we do? We draw a simple picture. What's happening if there is a service request? Typically you have the welcome center, level 1, level 2, level 3 support. So we look to that. We look then, so when is the record created? How is it processed? What kind of status, what kind of loops there are, like getting more information, getting a solution, deploying the solution, etc. And once we put that together, we looked into who is doing what, that you can typically do with some kind of swim lane diagram where you have the actors and you have the key activities. And suddenly what you realize in such a picture is how complex flow, which is perceived simple, but how complex that is in reality. You suddenly see that this defect or service request is handled by 5 to 10 different parties, and then you start wondering which is one which you can eliminate, which interface is not necessary. Can you put ownership into a team which is maybe sitting together so that they can handle it with their combined experience, etc. There's not a simple solution where you say, well, it's the easiest to put everything in one hand. I mean, you need different competence, you need different hierarchy, you need different jobs to approve, but nevertheless, the key principle here is to look to the streams of activity and then to look where do you really generate value and where do you have administration. And if you happen to cut out a little bit of the administration, you easily end up with a double-digit percentage point efficiency increase. We have then two principles which are key to lean, and one is about empowerment, which is to give ownership to where value is created, to ask the team to deliver, to make sure that they are measured on the success of a job, on the success of, let's say, increment, whatever is your structuring criteria, and don't interfere on a day-to-day basis. So the biggest enemy of empowerment is the normal micromanagement approach, where the boss would continuously say, well, I know it better, and did you look on that, and please don't forget to send an email here. By the way, we need another review, and make sure you copy me. This might all be helpful in certain cases, but is definitely creating situations where people feel like puppets, and the big boss would overlook everything, with the result that not only their motivation is decreasing, but also the quality is decreasing and the productivity is decreasing, because at the moment when they realize that there will be always somebody who looks to their work, I mean, it's obvious that they don't deliver the quality they would deliver if they are the owners of that job. So that's a very key principle which is directly linked to motivation, and as we are all aware, motivation is directly linked to productivity. That's the biggest, by far biggest, cash cow in lean principles. The last one, which might be a little bit difficult to read here, that's continuous improvement. That's probably something you have heard so often, and in a way it's something which we always claim we do, while in fact we We claim it, but I've seen many companies, they have so-called lessons learned reviews and stuff in their projects, but do they really close the loop? Do they really measure the effects? Do they, after a project, sit together and say, look, here we had too much defects. Look, here we had a set of defects which slipped through product test and came into system test. That was very costly to correct. Only if you close that loop and really look into what's at the moment the key topic we have to work on and how can we get it better, that's continuous improvement. For those who want to read nice stories on continuous improvement from a full different angle, I recommend Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The 7th habit, sharpen the saw, is a very short paragraph which amplifies the principle of continuous improvement in daily life, and that's something which is difficult to master, but make sure that we don't stagnate, because if we stand still, independent where we are, we will be overtaken by our competitors. Now, to look a little bit into some background of what I just mentioned, here's a chart which relates effort to value, and what I want to show is that there is a certain maximum of value, which is what we label here the target. Now, this target is very difficult to reach because it's just one point, and if you go left and right, you would reduce value. The important part is that we identify a zone where we say, well, this zone is what we call good enough. And as long as we're inside that zone, we create sufficient value for the customer. So the key message is, from this chart, we should be able to guide our thinking in the direction what to do when it is good enough, and how do we determine this spot where we would say this is good enough. A concrete example would be, for instance, requirements analysis. Often requirements analysis is done very lengthy with the consequence of what we call paralysis by analysis. That would mean that we go to the right with spending a lot of effort but not creating value. We over-specify. We write huge specifications which later on nobody would read, and I have plenty of cases where people literally write huge specifications where the supplier later on would say, well, in fact, we don't even have the time to read everything before we go ahead. We just mark what is most relevant, and then we start with our normal platform. It's just normal. I mean, big specifications are not read. On the other side, if we go to the left, that would mean not looking too much in requirement, but rather starting, for instance, working on a first increment and thinking, well, we can still add something in increment 2, 3, 4. That often has the consequence that increment 2, 3, 4 suddenly make severe architecture changes because we have overlooked some dependencies that also would be very costly. So this is why value on the left side would also decrease. We need to find this sweet spot of what is good enough. And if you are interested in some literature on this good enough principles, I highly recommend the very readable book of my colleague Al Davis, who has written on good enough requirements engineering. It's a very well written book. On waste, there's a lot of examples which we can see, and often it's very much linked to production. We should really look into waste from a perspective of what are the typical sources. Let's not only look to defects or late defect detection, but also let's look into, don't we finish work? There is a current paradigm in engineering, specifically software engineering and IT, which is called the technical debt, because partially done work sooner or later has to be repeated and it will be more expensive. And this is where we talk on waste. I mean, waste can also be if we don't do things right first time and then we have to repeat it, or if we have too many requirements changes, etc. Finally, the value stream analysis. I mean, this is something which, as I said earlier, has to look into the tasks, the process of how these tasks are handled. How can we, for instance, relate work packages to requirements, to test cases, etc. And we will suddenly realize, oh, well, this is a lot principles which we have known for a while, like small increments, like earned value approach. The important part is that we always look into who is working on a certain topic and where are the bottlenecks and how can we reduce frictions, how can we reduce the interface points. And this is why I so much recommend drawing a picture if you talk about value stream analysis. Now, this being said, the scope and impacts of these different paradigms vary. And we have here an archetypical life cycle. Agile is pretty much the development. Lean, as I said, is overlooking the overall life cycle. And this helps to distinguish the one from the other paradigm. Now, the effects of this also depend on the organization. For instance, if you have a collocated organization with even a small company, the success rate is quite high. Once we are distributed, like one side the East Coast, one side of the West Coast, you're all aware you have already the time zone difficulties, you have the distance difficulties. The success rate is already a little bit lower. If we have offshore, like the example with India or Mexico or Brazil or where else you work, you have additional challenges because you have suddenly also the culture changes. And this is why the success rate of such introduction of changes is very different. And the trust building is something which we have to do in any case, be it agile, lean, or any other type of development paradigm. And it also depends on the size and the how we manage these organizational changes. For instance, when we look into the success rate from a size perspective, what we see here is that bigger organizations typically have a huge burden of inherent inefficiency. We have done it all the time this way. There's a lot of process and other overheads that need to be judged from a perspective of do we need it. We are very much working with customers to reconsider established processes. My opinion here is at least once per year look to your processes and look what you can cut out, look what has changed in industry, look how you can be more efficient, look how to use more tools, better methodology, etc. A process which is 2, 3, 4 years old and has never been reworked, that's paperware and makes you really inflexible. And that's the drawback of big companies. I know about companies who are arrived at a stage where they are hardly able to create innovation just because of all these overheads of bodies who have to prove something, etc. And they would work with small suppliers just to get innovations out of the door, and this should make us think. So after these basic principles, I will now look into some performance topics. And obviously we can only talk about performance if we measure. So the measurement means that we should have a clear view into what are we doing and where do we create overheads, where are our value streams insufficient, where do we have rework, etc. Here's one example. This is only half of delivered features are seen valuable. What we mean with that is that independent which industry you are, this rule of thumb is that half of the requirements don't really bear much value, or vice versa. You deliver something, you will see that it is not really used. The pie chart is actually from a rather broad industry study from the Standish Group. It's already a while old, but we do that quite often if we are on requirements projects, and what we find is that the 50% of hardly or never used requirements, that's a rule of thumb which can be maintained today and can be maintained across industries. You might have heard about the approach of Kano, a Japanese person who had drawn a very simple model of 3 different type of requirements, so-called base features, so-called performance features, and so-called excellence features. And the latter group, this very few features, is really what drives purchasing decisions. You probably know it from your own purchasing behaviors. It's often this very small neat thing in terms of design or service or whatsoever which makes you change all your upfront analysis of what you would buy if you would think rational, because we are not rational, and that's the same in all our products. Base factors cannot be sold. It's assumed that they are in, but if we continuously try to keep them and add additional complexity, we are sooner or later in a situation where we cannot anymore handle the complexity. So we need occasionally also to refactor, rework our feature list and identify what could be features which we cut out, and that's of course then one aspect of value creation. Or if we look to innovation and how we spend money in industry, what we see is that 40% of innovation money is not really creating value. Here's a study which is from automotive industry, and what it shows is that about 40% of the 100 million plus minus US dollars is wrong investment, is waste, is not addressing needs. Now you can argue, well, this is still 60% success, but if you really look to the 60%, again, the real innovation part is not that big. And so each percentage point which we can carve out of the wrong and waste section helps us to be more attractive, helps us to be more successful. Another topic is allocation of people, and I've just recently worked on a rather big project with international teams, and we had been looking to the amount of projects to which people are assigned, and I found this very old curve in literature, which is already 20 years old. Now that sounds really very, very old-fashioned, but the shape holds up to today, which is if we have too many concurrent assigned tasks, our productivity decreases. One is not enough. It's also very clear because sometimes we have wait time. We have to wait for a tester to see whether our functionality is working. We might have to wait for a client to react on a question and requirements, etc. So the optimum is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 tasks on which somebody is assigned, and this is what should be considered. The best would certainly be if these tasks have some kind of relationship, but specifically for smaller companies that's hard to achieve, also where products are extremely complex. Here my recommendation would be that you have to look to both competencies, the parallelism of tasks, and also the degree of urgency, because if one person would work on the same time on 3 very urgent topics because 3 products are short before integration, he might soon burn out, because then it's too much stress here. But as a rule of thumb, 2 to 3 concurrent projects, concurrent tasks, that's what is reasonable to reduce inefficiency. And one example which we had been working from a lean perspective is on this topic of collaboration, of team empowerment, and our question was if we want to introduce Scrum, and I'm a very big fan and supporter of Scrum, so we would have these sprint cycles in product development, which is on this picture on the right side. So we have been looking into what's the input and how can we extend Scrum to a product and to a product management perspective. And this is the result here, which is that outside the regular sprint and daily sprints and daily Scrum, what we also want to achieve is that the outside perspective of the product management sprint, and even more the product backlog, is directly related to road mapping. This is a very important lever to make Scrum feasible for big, large and distributed projects, because in such cases there can be multiple overarching sprints, and so it's helpful to also have from the requirements and roadmap perspective onwards a clear picture into what can we do at a certain time and what will come with which prioritization. Value stream analysis is what I mentioned earlier already in terms of drawing the picture. This is one of these pictures where we look primarily in a very simple scenario into how is the workflow from a requirements perspective, who is handling which type of requirement. Then you can see from the upper left part, this is the funnel where the requirements are elicited and analyzed, and we have the engineering where architecture and modeling is done. We have integration, build management. We have finally the packaging, and then we do the reverse. In a way, and that's quite funny here, you could even see the classic V cycle in this approach, in this model. But obviously, the real important part is to look to interfaces and to find out, do we need these interfaces, which interfaces are important? And you might, for instance, come to a situation where you say, well, we have, for instance, here a lot of interfaces which go back and forth. So can we, for instance, put people working on these two tasks in the same team? Can we structure vertically so that different feature groups will be handled by such cross-functional teams? That could be a result. It can also be here, and that was very critical in the project, that there was even such overlaps between engineering and operations, which we then reduced by putting operations already much earlier in the preparation. You see, this is missing here, and that was one of the consequences which we took. Finally, waste is also if we have too much requirement changes. From our work with many different companies, what we learned is that change of requirement is rarely driven by clients or customers. Mostly requirement changes is a consequence of insufficient upstream preparation, insufficient analysis, insufficient understanding of requirements. So that's clearly something which is in our own hands, and so we shouldn't blame a customer. Often we just didn't ask the right questions, so it's part of our elicitation. And so it's important, and this is the picture here, that only for a small range of requirement changes we can really handle inside normal project, and this is about 20% maximum of requirement change. Anything which goes beyond will severely reduce the productivity. The picture is taken from a tool called QSM, where we investigate projects, and you can easily see that on the left side, with a little change we can manage. As soon as we go more to the right side, we reduce productivity. So it's worth to invest in requirements. In fact, an average company spends about 5 to 7% of effort before a project start in terms of requirements elicitation, development, analysis. If they would double that amount, and I'm not even saying this must be all before project start, that should be just done before the requirement enters into development, so that's also applicable to incremental development. If you would double the amount of requirements, elicitation, analysis, specification, to about 10 to 15%, you face an ROI is in the range of a factor of 4 to 5, which means that we save overall life cycle cost in a dimension of 20+%. I think it's obvious to understand, for instance, if you think about maintainability, if maintainability has been understood at the beginning, life cycle costs will drastically reduce because you can easier adapt, you can easier make corrections, make new features, etc. So with this background and these examples on value stream analysis, on waste reduction, on value creation, I would now like to draw your attention towards how can we actually implement. And the example which I will show here is a company which is in the industry and energy sectors, and they've been introduced lean development in a global setting. So this company has different branches around the world. They have a captive development center in India. They're active in 3 countries in Europe, and they have also branches, I think 3 offices in the United States, East Coast and one at the West Coast. So they have clearly quite big setting, and with the change needs or the targets they had, there was obviously cost reduction and schedule adherence. It was started about 2 years ago when we were just at the end of the previous economic downtime, where the trigger was that company has to reduce the development, the engineering and production costs. So what we looked into was here, how can we introduce change so that would be really supported by the teams. And I have now mapped this into 7 steps, and I will just walk you through these 7 steps. First step is to create urgency. That is to create an understanding for the need of change and make sure that the teams, the different stakeholders inside the companies understand that this change is critical, that in fact lean, for instance, as a activity which paradigm which we had introduced is relevant. If this is not understood, if they say, well, this is more nice to have, if there's not a clear management push for that, it's very difficult. After this push for urgency, a lot of the change is related to pull. So that's a quite interesting observation that we need push in terms of a vision, and you probably all have heard, at least since last October, about the management style of Steve Jobs, who was excellent in creating very, very strong visions. And once this vision is implanted in the mind, in the heart of the people, you can really leave them in small teams and they will achieve something. And the important part is to translate urgency into something which resonates with their own needs. That's what a good leader is capable to do. And in normal life, quote, what we do is to have different type of workshops, so that there is not just this one big meeting where the CEO or another C-level person would just tell, well, now we need this change, please go and implement, but rather that you would work with different group of stakeholders to understand what is the driver in their own behaviors, and this is what we call to create the urgency and translate it. The second step is to ensure sponsorship. Sponsors can be seen on different levels. I think the normal sponsorship which we think of is that we have a high manager available. Well, sometimes this is helpful, sometimes it could hinder a change in a way that people would wait for that person to tell them what to do. So again, in the workshops which we conduct in these early phases, we also try to understand the culture and then find out what would be the best possible sponsors. I've been working with engineering companies where sponsors would be rather from, I should say, quote, the lower part of the hierarchy, but if the right type of gurus would be identified, this would really move the company. I know about high-level managers who would try in this phase to really have small settings with some of the thought leaders on the engineering level, just to make sure that they are not disconnected. So there's not really the one patent recipe. Some cultures need a very strong top-down push. Others, for them it's enough if they have understood the urgency. They would probably rather cluster around these thought leaders. The key element here is that at the end of these first steps, ownership is starting to energize people. It should be, and that's the fourth bullet here, their own way. What will definitely not work is that if during these two first steps we not only say, well, it's urgent, but we already know what to do, and here is the process, here is the way to do things. That's a recipe for failure. So we need to elaborate with the different people what they could do in order to make it happen so that it is their way. And this is what we now have on this middle tier of the 7 steps, which is first of all then to translate it on the team level, establish a vision for action so that teams agree objectives. We are, as I said, we are now in a pull mode. The urgency is understood. The teams are asked to put objectives. This is typically a very difficult part in this whole 7-step approach because the objectives need to be actionable and they also need to speak the language of the teams so that you would not come top down and say, look, we need to reduce cost by 10 or 20 or X%. Maybe for one team that's adequate. Maybe another team, they do much better if they look to their cycle time, or another team how to reduce complexity, etc. In any case, it's important that the objectives are put in their own words, and they would be able to follow these objectives in their own respective activities. Now we need to make sure that these different operational teams, I'm not, by the way, talking about what we used to call process teams, I think that, or quality teams. I think this is counterproductive. I'm talking about operational teams when I mention the word team. So the next part is to facilitate that these teams would be able or capable to implement change. That is to identify stakeholders and change agents inside the team. That's normally a thing which they can easily do themselves. Then they have to set up an agenda how they work. They need to have training, and that's now the, I should say, the backdoor to introduce change, which is you should not top-down claim, we have here the solution, please implement. That was the 90s style of rather heavy process frameworks. Today, we know it's much easier to address people if they would understand the need. That's step one. If they translate that need into concrete objectives for their own, that's step three. And then to give them some training, some coaching on potential principles. So this is where finally, for instance, a lean workshop would come into the picture. To facilitate, they have the right view on the tools which are available. But they are empowered to make it their own story. Then we necessarily need communication, because with all these loosely coupled teams, it's important that we don't repeat errors in each team. So what we do often is to make management workshops, like every 2 to 4 weeks, we would just assemble people, or we do it in a webinar or in a online session. Let just one team elaborate what they've been doing, what they learned, etc. Important part is it should be consistent. It should reach out. You can either do that in the normal layout of a hierarchical structure, where you would call in the management, and they would further communicate to their teams. You can also slice it vertically to call in a product line or so. I see benefits in both. The important part is it should not be taken like a lecture, here is what works, but rather interactive, emotional in a way. What is working, what's not working, what did we learn, what did not work, what fears, what feedback can we get out of it. Well, with all this preparation and work in the team, it's important to deliver. I mean, this is where push and pull will meet, because at the end of the day, we want to see a change. So when we agree in step 3 on a concrete vision and an action plan, like in an agile project, like in a Scrum approach, we should deliver some results every 1 to 3 months. A change which will take longer than 3 months in order to deliver something has a much lower success rate than one which is always time boxed into 1 to 3 months. So this is also important to consider, that results must be available in order to keep the attention level. Well, and finally, the last step is to make sure that the changes are not just inside a project, inside a team, but they also get into the genes of the organization, that culture is addressed. And that is what we call capitalize on changes. For instance, if you have saved X amount of effort during test, it's important that this X% is not anymore part of our planning, but it's really carved out of the test. Maybe if you save 5% in testing, you take 5% of the testers who would in the future work on development, which is anyway more constructive than testing. So it's important that this would really be visible to the organization, and then also seen as realistic to deliver. What we had learned from this case study is that we need a blend of different change needs. We need to energize. We certainly need some training, but what we don't need is to kind of tell them this is what you have to do, but rather here is the tools, here are the criteria. Now in a workshop try to adapt to your own environment. That is what energizes people. Second, we have a combination of pull and push, which is relevant in order to make sure that on the one side a vision and an urgency is communicated, that's the push. On the other side, people would also demand for themselves change. They want to know how to do better and how to implement. Then we need to make sure that the teams would translate Lean into their own practices. We can provide them with benchmarks, with expertise from different corners of the company or from other companies. We can work with them on checklists. We can do a lot of topics like a value stream analysis, etc. But these are all tools. Lean will not be introduced by doing this big value stream analysis, which nobody would understand because it's so overly complex. It works because people understand that the value stream analysis is a useful tool to look into the frictions which they face in their day-to-day work and draw the pictures themselves. So if I'm working with a company on Lean, when I draw the picture of, for instance, value stream analysis or do analysis on waste, I try to do that with the people, and I try to do that not in a small isolated circle, but really to help them understand and learn from it. Finally, it's important to take all these principles always as something to be adaptable. This is also why I didn't emphasize so much on very specific principles, but rather on the scheme, or as Jim Highsmith would call it, these simple rules, which would then be tailored to the own environment. And when I conclude here, I think it's clear for all of us that we continuously have to challenge and improve our productivity. It's impacted by external factors, but we should never come into that trap to say, well, it's something I cannot cure because it's created outside my own world. Productivity is primarily driven by motivation. Productivity is primarily driven by teams. And so any approach to improve productivity is also starting on that level. And there are a lot of different handles to do that, but they have to be specifically identified in order to make sense. The simple rule which I follow in introducing Lean is what I call RACE, which is reduce accident, control essence, because these two elements to always look into where are my accidents. This is frictions, this is waste, this is interfaces which are not necessary, this is too much review, too much process as an overhead. On the other side, also understanding what's really necessary. We can only develop complex products. We can only follow today's business if we have a minimum set of business process, if we have a good understanding of who has which responsibility, etc. What are the key product features? What's the architecture? That's the essence. And the essence has to be controlled. If we cut out something from the essence, maybe we just kill our own business. So it's a deliberate balance between reducing the accidents and still controlling the essence. There's two books I want to draw your attention. One which we have recently republished in a fully new edition, which is Global Software and IT, which looks primarily on distributed development projects and outsourcing. And as you can see from this quote from Wipro, it's really seen as a rather complete guidebook. I think the biggest added value here is that a lot of people from very different companies and industries have contributed with case studies. So it's really a book on practice, not so much a theory primer on global software. The other one we need to measure in order to control. And so over the years, we have collected a lot of experiences on measurement and improving in a objective-driven way. And here is a book which is really built around benchmarks, case studies, industry experiences. So while the first book is more on case studies from a perspective of how did we do, this book is more in looking case studies and benchmarks into what can we learn, what was achieved, and how was it measured, and helps with topics like planning, estimation, etc. So they kind of enrich each other. And that brings me to the end of this brief presentation, and looking then forward to any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Christoph. Thank you. We do have one